Our last presentation considered the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this presentation, we want to look at Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism is an Indian religion or way of life widely practiced in South Asia. It's been called the oldest religion in the world, and some practitioners and scholars refer to it as the eternal tradition or the eternal way. It's estimated that 80% of Indians practice Hinduism. That means around 960 million people, which is about half or somewhat less than half the number of people who are Muslims or Christians in the world. Buddhism could be understood as an offshoot of Hinduism that follows teachings attributed to Buddha. People who practice Buddhism are found around the world, but mostly in Tibet, Nepal, China, and the countries of Southeast Asia, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Hinduism and Buddhism share certain significant perspectives on life and death. First, they both affirm the idea of reincarnation, that is, that all living things are born, die, and reborn over and over again. Both affirm that the purpose of life is liberation or moksha from this cycle of birth and rebirth through living rightly. Interestingly, Bulow and colleagues suggest that this represents a kind of coping with death by its denial. I'm not sure that's fair, but their claim makes a kind of sense. Both Hinduism and Buddhism affirm the idea of karma. Karma, according to Nimbalkar, quote, is the net consequence of good and bad deeds in a person's life, which then determines the nature of the next life. Ongoing accumulation of bad karma prevents moksha, unquote. If one lives well, they are reincarnated upwards, ever closer to moksha or liberation. If one lives poorly, they are reincarnated downward. Finally, Hinduism affirms the idea of ahimsa, which means non-violence, non-injury, or non-killing. You might call it simply a very strong affirmation of what we have called the principle of non-maleficence. Bulow and colleagues note that in Hinduism, quote, untimely death is seriously mourned. The way you die is thought to be important. A good death is signified by old age, having said one's goodbyes, and all one's duties having been settled. Bad death is violent, premature, in the wrong place, not at home or at the river Ganges, and signified by vomit, feces, urine, and an unpleasant expression. Death in an ICU seems to fall into the category of a bad death, unquote. Consistent with all this, Bulow and his colleagues have noted that practitioners of Hinduism typically accept do not resuscitate orders because CPR seems to violate the desire for a peaceful and untraumatic dying. Artificially or mechanically sustaining life is of little value. All of this suggests then a kind of acceptance of what we have called passive euthanasia or the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. Bulow's essay also points to a rule within the Hindu tradition, quote, that a terminally ill person may hasten death as a spiritual purification to promote detachment and to ensure no signs of bad death, feces, vomit, or urine, unquote. The Hindu and Buddhist emphasis on the spiritual work, we might say, that needs to be done at death and rebirth means that the ideal death is, quote, a conscious death, unquote, according to Nimbalkar. And this means that palliative treatment will often be a problem if pain-killing medications reduce mental alertness. Similarly, Nimbalkar writes, quote, the spiritual goal of liberation can also be seen as an ethical reason for seeking or hastening death. When physical suffering impedes self-control and lucidity, it's permissible to shorten life. Pain or lethargy might cloud the awareness and consciousness at death that both Hindus and Buddhists believe is necessary to ensure a favorable rebirth. Extreme suffering might also cause someone to be so attached to their material life, their bodily condition, that they cannot pursue the ultimate spiritual goal of liberation from the material world, unquote. Now, the means by which one seeks or hastens death may involve both what we have called passive and even active euthanasia, though there is tension within the Hindu and Buddhist belief system on this. On the one hand, given its emphasis on ahimsa, acting to hasten a person's death could produce very bad karma for both the patient who requests it or the physician who goes along with it. This is consistent with the condemnation of suicide within both traditions. However, there is a distinction made between self-regarding reasons and other regarding or compassionate motives for seeking death. Nimbalkar's examples point to what we are calling passive euthanasia. He writes, therefore, quote, a person can decide to forego treatment. Why? To avoid imposing a heavy burden of caregiving on the family or friends. He or she may also stop treatment to relieve loved ones of the emotional or economic distress of prolonging death. Moreover, there is also a tradition of pryopavesa, or fasting to death, which is accepted and even praised. It, quote, is not regarded as suicide because it's natural and nonviolent and is acceptable only for spiritually advanced people under certain circumstances. It's used when it is the right time for this life to end, when this body has served its purpose and become a burden. Unlike suicide, fasting to death is a gradual process, giving ample time for the patient and his community to prepare for the person's demise. The difference between suicide and pryopavesa is that while suicide is often associated with feelings of frustration, depression, or anger, pryopavesa is associated with feelings of serenity. It is only for those people who are fulfilled, who have no desire or ambition left, and no responsibility remaining in this life, unquote. So we can see here a profound tension within the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, I think, between a strong commitment to the preservation of life represented in the idea of ahimsa, and at the same time a recognition that a good death may mean one that is hastened, even actively in some rare circumstances, in order to preserve significant spiritual values. An ideal death, you should be clear, from the Hindu and Buddhist perspective, is not necessarily one that is absolutely pain-free. The important issue is that the person transitioning from one life to the next be in a condition to do the spiritual work necessary to a good transition. I do want to add one word with respect to a distinctly Buddhist approach to these matters. Buddhism is noteworthy for its idea that suffering, which is more than merely pain, is caused by attachment or desire. We suffer because we are attached to things or desire things, and therefore the key to overcoming suffering is to eliminate attachment or desire. Now, ultimately, this could be applied to an attachment to physical life itself, or a desire to live longer. Damien Keown, in an article on the Buddhist view of these matters, says this, quote, Buddhism does not believe there is a moral obligation to preserve life at all costs. Recognizing the inevitability of death, of course, is a central element in Buddhist teachings. Death cannot be postponed forever, and Buddhists are encouraged to be mindful and prepared for the evil hour when it comes. To seek to prolong life beyond its natural span by recourse to increasingly elaborate technology when no cure or recovery is in sight is a denial of the reality of human mortality, and would be seen by Buddhism as arising from delusion and excessive attachment. Well, I think it's fair to say, even from this very brief introduction, that the world's religious traditions all wrestle imaginatively within the framework of their particular systems of belief with the challenges presented by illness and death and the decisions that must be made about medical care at the end of life. I think it's fair to say that each in their own ways balance a profound commitment to the valuing and preservation of physical life, rooted in a sense that our lives are not our own and that God or some transcendent source is the ultimate giver and taker of life. On the other hand, each in their own way accept the inevitability of death and aspire to some sort of good or ideal death, understood in spiritual terms and not entirely with respect to what we have called quality of life considerations. This is probably most clearly shown in Hindu and Buddhist concerns about pain medication that could cloud the awareness that one needs as one makes the spiritual journey from this life to the next. All traditions seem to affirm in one way or another that our obligation to preserve life is limited. And those limitations have in part to do with the recognition that whatever transcendent meaning our lives have, it's not swallowed up or obliterated by physical death. I think here of the words of a Christian creed from the Church of Canada. It says, "In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone." Such a perspective, not unlike the Buddhist one, suggests that a person of faith is not too attached, not attached too strongly to this life, but trusts in something or someone larger than our lives that enabled us ultimately to let go of it, but not too quickly.